I was absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, barely listening as David and Kyle discussed the latest news. Their conversation drifted around me, distant and devoid of meaning, almost like background noise. The soft glow of my screen felt calming, a barrier between me and the scene unfolding at the table, drawing my thoughts away from the familiar evening and the conversations I had long ceased to find engaging. Then, Kyle's voice broke my solitude. "David, I never knew your main rival for Emma's attention was her phone." I looked up and met his gaze. Something deeper than mere teasing sparkled in his eyes as he looked at me, a slight smile playing on his lips. David dismissed it with a wave, continuing his story, but a cold shiver ran through me. It was as though his gaze hinted at something unsaid, something we both kept silent. "Well, the night's not over yet," I replied with a playful tone, trying to mask a slight unease. "Maybe you'll still manage to win my attention." Kyle's smile grew as he held my gaze, accepting the challenge. He reached with one hand to pour more wine into my glass, while his other hand slowly, deliberately rested on my bare knee, exposed just slightly from beneath my dress. His fingers pressed into my skin, firmer than a casual touch. The moment was fleeting, but it left an impression of something powerful, beyond control. His hand was warmer than I expected, and feeling that confident pressure, I could hardly stifle a quiet gasp that slipped into tense silence. Seconds stretched out as his fingers, slightly curled, rested on my skin. We both pretended it was accidental, but the feeling of his hand on my knee burned more intensely than any innocent kiss could. David, too absorbed in his story, noticed nothing, but between Kyle and me, an invisible line had been drawn that evening. His touch had ceased to be mere flirtation. It was more, a challenge, a desire, an invitation. Our eyes met briefly, and I felt myself unable to resist answering that silent pull. For the rest of the dinner, I found myself lost, my thoughts entangled with the sensation of his hand, his fingers pressing gently on my knee. I tried to mask my unease, but each time he cast me a fleeting glance, my heart raced faster. By the time the dinner ended, I felt like I was on the brink of something much more than just a game. When David was momentarily distracted by a conversation with another guest, Kyle leaned close to me and whispered in my ear, "Well, who won tonight? Your phone or me?" I couldn't help but laugh quietly, feeling my heartbeat quicken once again. "This time I think it's a tie," I replied with a smile. "But maybe you'll have another chance to win." Kyle and I stood in the kitchen, helping David prepare dinner. It wasn't often that David got this involved in cooking, and it added a warm, unfamiliar touch to the evening. Kyle, always quick with a joke, kept the mood light, and after a while he suggested doing something special for dessert. "How about whipped cream?" he offered, pulling out a whisk and a carton of cream from the fridge. "A little sweetness never hurts after a meal." While David was busy with the main course, Kyle started whipping the cream with a serious expression, adding a bit of sugar and watching the texture carefully. His movements were confident and natural, and even the simple act of making dessert became captivating under his hands. Once the cream was ready, Kyle turned to me, filling a spoon and holding it close to my lips, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Try it. I think something's missing," he said, his voice carrying a playful hint. I laughed, glancing at David before leaning in slightly to taste the cream. It was soft, slightly sweet, but there was something personal, something more than just offering a taste. Kyle held the spoon near my lips just a second longer than necessary, his hand lingering close to my face as if it were perfectly natural. In that moment, David turned and noticed our playful exchange. His gaze grew serious for a moment, seeming to pick up on something unusual in this simple gesture. I quickly looked away, feeling my face grow warm, while Kyle merely smiled, returning to his casual demeanor as if nothing had happened. When David turned back to the stove and got distracted again, Kyle stepped closer to me. His hand moved to my waist, lingering just for a second, but with a certainty that made me aware of every inch of space between us. His fingers trailed along my waist, leaving a faint warmth behind. And before I could fully grasp what was happening, he gently touched my chin, lifting it so I'd meet his gaze. I froze, catching his eyes, which were far more open and honest than any words could be. His touch, light but deliberate, wrapped me in warmth for a brief moment. In that instant, there was nothing accidental left between us. It was an open challenge, one I couldn't help but respond to. Kyle winked and, quickly stepping back, returned to the dessert as if nothing had happened. But his gaze told a different story. I stood there, heart pounding, my thoughts circling back to his hand that had left its mark on my waist. Kyle stayed over that night. The house was enveloped in silence, with only the faint glow of a lamp in the living room piercing the soft darkness. I had been lying in bed, unable to sleep, my thoughts drifting back to the way Kyle had acted during dinner, those casual touches, the lingering glances he threw my way. At some point, I realized I wouldn't be able to rest until I cleared my head, so I quietly went downstairs to the living room. There, I found Kyle. He was sitting back in an armchair, looking thoughtful, as if lost in his own reflections. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up, and a warm smile crossed his face. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded, feeling a faint flutter of nervousness inside me. His gaze was open, and in the dim light, it felt like he looked at me not just as the lady of the house, but as a woman he'd long wanted to understand. Kyle began speaking, sharing parts of his life, details he had never mentioned before. His voice was soft and deep, mesmerizing in a way that I hadn't expected. After a moment, he noticed my tiredness and moved closer, resting his hand gently on my shoulder. His touch was warm and tender, yet beneath his fingers I sensed something more, a strength, as though he was trying to convey something unspoken. He lightly stroked my shoulder, and his closeness filled the room with a subtle yet undeniable tension. We were standing very close, and he held my gaze, his eyes filled with something powerful and sincere. I felt his fingers unconsciously tighten around my shoulder, and in that moment my breathing grew heavier, as if I'd lost myself in his gaze. Neither of us looked away, and time seemed to freeze, leaving us alone in this small moment. His face was so close that I could feel his breath, and the seconds stretched endlessly. My hand, almost unaware, reached toward his shoulder. But before I could fully grasp the feeling, I jolted, as if waking up, and took a step back. Kyle slowly lowered his hand, but his eyes held that same steady, certain look, as if he already knew what had just happened between us in that brief instant, even if I hadn't fully grasped it myself. We stood in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed something between us forever. On one of those warm summer days, David decided to organize a picnic for us, wanting to enjoy the fresh air. We spread out a blanket on the soft grass under a tree, laid out the food baskets, and each of us enjoyed the tranquility and simplicity of the moment. The light breeze, the scent of grass, and the bright sun made the day feel almost perfect. Kyle, as always, was full of energy and good humor. He kept making jokes, adding a sense of ease and fun to our picnic. At one point, he picked up a small tub of ice cream, opened it, and scooping a bit onto a spoon, turned to me with a playful smile, clearly intending to recreate our recent moment with the whipped cream. "Well, do you trust my taste?" he asked teasingly, bringing the spoon close to my lips. I couldn't help but laugh. He did it with such a playful, almost childlike expression that it was both funny and unexpectedly sweet. I leaned in cautiously to taste the ice cream, but just as I did, Kyle deftly shifted the spoon so it brushed lightly against my lips. The ice cream was cold, but his gaze was warm and intense, as if for that moment we were alone. For a brief second, Kyle held the spoon near my lips longer than necessary, and in that slight pause there was something bold, almost provocative. I felt my heart beat a little faster, and a slight blush rose to my cheeks as I tried to control my excitement. Then David's sharp voice cut through the moment, breaking our tense little game. "Maybe that's enough? Those kinds of jokes are usually between couples, not friends," he said, barely containing his irritation. "And stop feeding my wife, for that matter." Kyle glanced at David, then returned the spoon to the ice cream container, offering a faintly apologetic smile. "Sorry, David," he said calmly, though it was clear that his friend's words didn't really faze him. I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment. David turned away again, trying to hide his irritation, but I could feel the tension in the air. And Kyle, despite the remark, kept looking at me with that calm, slightly defiant gaze, as if he was testing my boundaries, sparking the same thrill in me that he carried in his smile. I looked away, feeling both embarrassed and a warm thrill from his boldness, from the confidence with which he played this little game. The moment made me wonder what this all meant for us, and whether we had already crossed a line. After the picnic, which had turned out more intense than I'd expected, David was called away on an urgent work trip. Kyle stayed behind to walk me home, and although it should have been a simple goodbye, there was a sense of unspoken tension hanging between us. As we approached the house, I slowed my steps by the front door, hesitating to break the calmness of the moment. The evening dusk cast a soft haze around us, and the gentle glow from the porch light illuminated Kyle's face, highlighting the quiet, thoughtful look in his eyes. He turned to me, his expression warm but different from his usual lighthearted smile. His gaze was more serious, more genuine. "Thank you for today, Kyle," I said, trying to keep my tone even. He stepped a bit closer, nodding slightly without breaking eye contact. For a moment I thought he might say something, but instead his hand drifted to my back. His fingers lightly touched me through the thin fabric, but there was something captivating in that touch, as if his hand had found its natural place. He gently drew me closer, and I felt the space between us disappear, his scent and the quiet steadiness of his breathing enveloping me in a sense of comfort. With our faces close, our gazes met, and I couldn't look away. He slowly leaned in, brushing his lips against mine, almost testing to see if I would respond. It was a soft, tentative kiss, barely there, but in it lay a promise of something more, something we both seemed to reach for. I returned his kiss, and in that moment we'd already crossed a line. The kiss grew slightly deeper, and his hand on my back pressed gently, holding me with a restrained certainty. His fingers seemed to press into my skin, as though he had waited for this and feared breaking the connection. I felt his other arm wrap around me, creating a sense of closeness and warmth, as if, in that moment, it was just the two of us in our own world. The soft glow from the porch light seemed to dim everything around us, making the quiet of the evening feel both comforting and detached from reality. I knew this was not what we should be doing, that we'd let things go too far, but standing here, wrapped in his arms, I felt more alive and present than I had in a long time. There was a comfort, a simplicity in the moment that felt undeniably right. Without another word, I turned and opened the door, allowing us to step quietly inside. In the gentle light of the entryway, every sound seemed amplified, every breath a little louder. I could feel his warmth beside me, his hand still resting on my back, steady and reassuring. He looked at me, his gaze kind yet full of unspoken emotions. Knowing that David wouldn't be back for some time only made the moment feel more real, more immediate. Kyle's hand drifted to my waist, resting there for just a moment, and in that touch I could sense a deep, unhurried patience. This moment, filled with an undeniable closeness, felt like a step we had both been moving toward for a long time. After spending a few hours together in light conversation, Kyle had gone home, leaving me with mixed emotions. But the next morning, everything changed abruptly. David, clearly unsettled, started a conversation that quickly escalated into a heated argument. He expressed his disapproval of my interactions with Kyle, accusing me of inappropriate flirtation with his friend. "I didn't think I'd have to say this, but something's off between you and Kyle," he said sharply. "I want you to stop it before it goes too far." His voice was filled with resentment and frustration. I tried to explain that nothing serious was going on, but he continued his accusations, unwilling to hear me out. Soon, our conversation devolved into a full-blown argument, leaving me feeling misunderstood and overwhelmed. David saw betrayal in my actions, while I struggled with my own complicated, conflicting emotions. Unable to handle the tension any longer, I left the house without a word, seeking some kind of relief. I barely thought about where I was going until I found myself in front of Kyle's house. At that moment, all I wanted was to escape the heaviness of the argument and find a sense of peace with someone who, I felt, truly understood me. I stood there, hesitating before I knocked, but he seemed to sense my presence and opened the door himself. His expression softened with immediate concern. "Emma, what happened?" he asked gently, and suddenly I felt a wave of emotion rise in me. Unable to hold back, I told him about the argument with David, about the feeling of being misunderstood and worn down. He listened quietly, his gaze warm and attentive, and when I finished, he gently pulled me into an embrace. His hands rested lightly on my back, softly massaging my shoulders, and I felt the tension within me begin to fade. His touch was so natural and comforting that I felt safe, and the tears stopped on their own. Slowly, his hands drifted lower, and his fingers lingered at my waist. We stood by the fireplace, his hands resting on my waist, and I knew that this moment held something much deeper than just comfort. His touch was not only soothing but carried a hidden, intense feeling he no longer tried to disguise. He leaned in close, his lips nearly brushing my ear as he whispered, "You deserve more, Emma." Those words, quiet yet firm, awakened something within me that I had long tried to suppress. He held my face gently, his fingers pressing softly against my skin, and looking into my eyes, he seemed to communicate all that he had kept inside. I couldn't look away, and the moment stretched out, filling the space around us. Kyle slowly leaned down and kissed me, at first cautiously, as if testing whether I was ready to respond. But soon the kiss grew deeper, more intent, and I felt myself unable to resist any longer. My fingers slipped over his shoulders, and in that instant, I felt a sense of freedom, fully embracing the impulse that had lingered between us for so long. That evening by the fireplace was something neither of us could ignore anymore. After our recent argument, David and I still carried an unspoken tension between us, though in the company of friends, we skillfully pretended everything was fine. We sat at a long table in a cozy cafe, surrounded by familiar faces, and though David was right beside me, a quiet storm lingered beneath our polished surface. Every now and then, my gaze drifted to Kyle, and each time our eyes met, I felt a flash of something forbidden, a secret only the two of us shared. Kyle sat beside me, close enough that his presence was unmistakable. During a lull in the conversation, while everyone was absorbed in their own chats, I felt his hand rest on my knee beneath the table. His touch was subtle yet intentional, fingers pressing lightly. Startled, I felt a warm current spread from his hand, and a shiver ran up my spine. I shot him a quick, questioning glance, only to find him looking back with calm confidence, his gaze steady and untroubled. Instead of withdrawing his hand, he let it drift slightly higher, his fingers brushing against my thigh in a gesture that was both bold and discreet. The contact was brief, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but it ignited a hidden thrill within me, something that hadn't been stirred in a long time. My heart pounded faster, and although I knew I should have gently moved his hand away, I didn't. Our eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, it felt as though we existed in a world separate from everyone else, a world where only he and I understood the unspoken tension between us. Suddenly, Kyle's hand moved away, almost instinctively as we heard footsteps approaching. It was David, returning from another part of the cafe, unaware of the subtle exchange that had just passed between us. He slid back into his seat, joining the conversation as though nothing had happened, blissfully oblivious. I leaned slightly toward Kyle, my voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be so bold in public. Someone might see us." A subtle smile played on his lips as he replied, his tone low and unwavering. "That's the best part, Emma. The thrill of almost getting caught." His words sent a rush of conflicting emotions through me, a mix of fear and undeniable allure. It felt risky, even dangerous, yet exhilarating in a way I couldn't ignore. This brief, stolen moment became yet another layer in the growing connection between us, something unacknowledged but impossible to dismiss. The rest of the evening continued as usual, or so it appeared to anyone watching. I sat close to David, exchanging polite words with him, yet all the while my mind drifted back to that moment with Kyle, his hand lingering on my leg, the quiet defiance in his voice. The forbidden nature of it all only heightened the thrill, making every accidental brush of our hands, every fleeting glance, feel charged with meaning. As the laughter and conversation flowed around us, I found myself distracted, wondering if this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous than I'd let myself imagine. Ever since our lingering glances and fleeting touches crossed the line, something fundamental had shifted between Kyle and me. Each time we exchanged those quiet, secret moments, every touch, every unspoken feeling, The weight of our connection grew heavier. We both knew we'd gone too far, and that knowledge stirred a turmoil of guilt and hesitation within me. We were conscious of the boundaries we were crossing, but no matter how much I tried to resist, my feelings only intensified. That evening, when I found myself at his place again, my heart was a storm of conflicted emotions. The pull I felt toward him was undeniable, yet I knew, deep down, that we were stepping onto dangerous ground. I kept telling myself that what we were doing was wrong, that we needed to stop before we destroyed everything around us. But standing there in his presence, I felt every logical thought dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming longing. Kyle seemed to feel the same internal struggle. I could see it in his eyes, an unspoken tension mixed with something deeper, something he no longer tried to hide. "Emma," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know this is wrong. If we don't stop, we could lose everything." His words echoed my own thoughts, each one resonating within me. He, just like I, understood the risk. I nodded, unable to find the words, my hands trembling slightly as I held his gaze. It was impossible to deny that we were on the edge of something that could change everything. "I know," I finally replied, my voice catching slightly. "But this feeling is stronger than anything I've ever felt. I've tried to fight it, Kyle. I really have, but every time I'm near you, it all just fades away." Silence hung between us for a few moments, the weight of our words settling heavily in the air. I could tell he was wrestling with his own fears and principles, but there was a look in his eyes that told me he had made his decision, just as I had. Slowly, Kyle stepped closer, his movements deliberate, as if he were giving me one last chance to change my mind. His gaze held mine, and in it, I saw a mixture of tenderness and determination. Gently, but with an unyielding certainty, he pressed me against the wall, his hands wrapping firmly around my waist as though he was afraid I might pull away at the last moment. Our faces were so close that I could feel his breath against my skin. His lips brushed mine, almost tentatively, as if testing the waters. But then he leaned in further, and the kiss deepened, slowly at first, full of all the emotions we had kept hidden. I responded, unable to hold back, and everything else fell away. It was a silent, intense kiss that spoke of every unexpressed feeling. Gradually, his kiss became more insistent, more certain, and I felt his hands tighten on my waist as if he never wanted to let go. In those few moments, everything seemed to melt away. Our fears, our doubts, the boundaries we had set. The passion we'd suppressed for so long finally came flooding to the surface. I could feel his hands pressing into my back, holding me as though trying to capture the moment, to make it last. My own arm slipped around his neck, and as I inhaled the scent of him, I felt alive in a way I hadn't for a very long time. He pulled back slightly, his gaze intense, almost pained, and he whispered, "I know we shouldn't be doing this. But Emma, I've waited so long for this." I exhaled, unable to form a response. We both knew this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we'd tried to protect. But as I looked back into his eyes, full of warmth and honesty, my last defenses faded away. We remained there by the wall, our kisses growing deeper, more urgent, and each touch more honest and raw than the last. In that moment, we didn't need words. We both understood that our actions would have consequences, but the emotions that had been building between us had finally broken free, leaving us with nothing but the truth of our feelings. In recent days, David had felt that something was wrong. Emma seemed distant, her responses short, her gaze often far away. These small but noticeable changes troubled him, though he tried not to dwell on them. But a persistent voice in his mind kept whispering that something wasn't right. That day, he came home earlier than usual. Expecting an empty house, he was surprised to hear voices in the living room. Silently, he moved closer, and the scene before him made his heart freeze. Kyle stood close to Emma, his hands resting firmly on her shoulders, holding her in a way that seemed possessive. Despite the gentle touch, there was a sense of intimacy in the gesture that was impossible to ignore. Emma looked at him with an expression David had never seen before. Anger flared within him, and unable to contain himself, he stepped into the room, his face flushed with hurt and fury. Emma and Kyle turned abruptly, their expressions freezing as they realized they had been caught. David took a step forward, his voice breaking into a shout. "So this is it then?" His voice was filled with anger and pain. "I trusted both of you. I worked hard to make this relationship work for us. And you, Kyle. You were like a brother to me. Now I see everything I've built just crumbling before my eyes." Emma opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered. She looked down, knowing that any words would only sound like hollow excuses. Kyle, however, stepped forward, struggling to keep his own anger in check as he tried to explain. "David, I know how it looks, but it's more complicated than you think. This wasn't about hurting you," he started, but David cut him off sharply. "Don't you dare tell me it's not that simple. You were my friend. I trusted you. I was always there for you, and you betrayed me. And you, Emma, I thought you were honest with me, that you would never do something like this." His words cut deep like a blade, and for Emma, it was unbearable. Tears welled up in her eyes, knowing that nothing she could say would make things right. "David, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't change what happened, but please understand." But David could no longer hear her. His gaze was filled with disappointment and bitterness. "I've lost not only my wife but also my best friend," he said, his voice quieter now yet full of immeasurable pain. "Everything I worked for has been destroyed by the two of you. No matter what happens next, there's nothing left between us." With those words, he turned and walked out, leaving them in a silence so tense it seemed to suffocate the room. Emma and Kyle stood frozen, feeling the weight of their actions and knowing that the consequences of this moment would haunt them for a long time. After David's departure, the silence in the room became unbearable. Time seemed to stand still, leaving Kyle and me standing in an empty, quiet space. A heavy weight hung in the air, reminding us of what we had just destroyed. I looked at Kyle, and for the first time I saw the same despair and fear in his eyes that were echoing inside me. "We both knew this might happen," he said quietly, his voice hollow, as if the words were hard to say. I nodded silently, unsure of what to say. Our feelings were too complicated, too tangled to express in words. We both knew that what was between us couldn't stay hidden forever. But still, when the truth finally came out, it felt like a blow I hadn't anticipated. David wasn't just my husband. He was a man to whom I had dedicated years of my life, and now all of that was in ruins. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I can't go back, and I can't pretend this didn't happen." Kyle took a step toward me, his expression filled with regret and worry. "Emma, I know we've broken a lot, but I know one thing. My feelings for you are real. I can't just forget everything as if it didn't matter." His words moved me, yet I also knew that this situation was more complex than either of us wanted to admit. We were standing among the broken pieces of everything I had built with David, and we couldn't pretend it didn't matter. My relationship with Kyle was full of passion and sincerity, but it came with consequences I couldn't ignore. "And what happens next?" I asked, holding back tears. "How do we live after this? We both know this wasn't just a moment of weakness, but is it worth it, if in the end we've destroyed everything?" Kyle listened without interrupting, and I felt him step closer, gently reaching for my hand. "Maybe it's worth it to find those new answers, Emma," he said, his voice calm and full of conviction. "I'm ready to go through this with you, no matter how hard it is. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm willing to take responsibility for what's between us." His words brought both relief and fear. We both knew that a difficult road lay ahead. Perhaps the answer wasn't to try to fix everything, but to accept what had happened, and to understand if we were ready to face the consequences together. I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as I finally reached a decision. "Kyle, I need time to figure things out," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "I have to process this, to come to terms with my divorce from David. I'm not ready to start something new without understanding what's going on inside me." Kyle nodded, his gaze full of patience and understanding. "I'll wait, Emma," he replied gently. "As long as you need." His words brought me a sense of calm, and though the path ahead was bound to be difficult, I knew this moment had opened up a space for me to truly understand myself and what I wanted. Weeks passed, and life around me began to settle into some semblance of normalcy. But inside, I felt an emptiness I couldn't fill, whether in solitude or even in my moments with Kyle. It was as if everything was shrouded in fog, and each day was filled with questions I had no answers to. I spent a lot of time reflecting on the years I shared with David, the happy moments, the life we built together. Doubt crept into my heart. Was it right to destroy everything we had created for emotions, even ones as vivid and real as those I felt with Kyle? At times, I thought that the only right choice was to try to ask David for forgiveness, to explain everything I barely understood myself, and to try to rebuild what we had broken. But whenever I was with Kyle, my thoughts shifted. In his presence, I felt like a different person. The passion, the freedom, the honesty we shared awakened something new in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Being with him was exhilarating, yet strangely calming, as though I had finally allowed myself to be the person I always wanted to be. Kyle didn't ask me for answers. He didn't push or demand, and that gave me strength. I saw acceptance and understanding in his eyes, but he also knew I wasn't ready to make a choice. One evening, after another quiet, comforting moment spent with Kyle, I found myself once again at a crossroads. Inside me, two opposing forces pulled me in different directions. Part of me wanted to go back to David, to apologize and try to rebuild our life together. But another part of me wanted to stay with Kyle, to explore the new sense of freedom and passion he had awakened within me. Late that night, I sat by the window, gazing at the starry sky. The silence was deep and comforting, but inside I felt a storm brewing. Perhaps I would never find a simple answer. Perhaps the choice wouldn't be as final as I once thought. Now I understood that life isn't always black and white, that each decision hides a whole palette of emotions, fears, and hopes. I didn't know what lay ahead, whether I would try to mend things with David or embrace a new path with Kyle. But one thing was certain. Whatever choice I made, it would have to be my own, with no looking back and no promises for the future.